Today is the World Day of Prayer for vocations to the priesthood. Most of the priests I know are people who kind of turmoiled and fought with the call of God. I know a couple who knew that they wanted to be a priest almost from the time of their first communion, but I don't think that's the story of most of us. I know it's not my story. When I was in school, I always thought of being an architect. I used to love playing with those building blocks and mechano sets and all kinds of things, and that's what I had my heart set on. My mother, of course, had her heart set on me being a doctor. And of course, being the oldest, she expected me to get married and give her grandchildren. And so she was a little disappointed when I announced that I was going to go to the seminary. But even that road was a little different. Why? Because when I got into the last years of high school, all of a sudden we started studying calculus and chemistry and physics and mathematics, and I did terrible at those things. I did not like math, and it did not like me. I've always described myself as a late bloomer. I was in high school, actually, before I started to become an altar server. And I think it was that association and my classmates, who some of them were talking about priesthood as well, that directed my thoughts in that way. The priest who ran the school really involved a lot of the students in the running of things. I was chosen to run the sacristy. We had Mass every day. Another classmate of mine was in charge of the altar servers. Another student, would you believe, ran the bookstore that was there. And I think it was that directed my efforts. And so at the end of high school, I went to see my parish priest, who I knew very well, and told him I was thinking I'd like to go to the seminary. And he said to me, well, he said in days of old, people went to the seminary right after high school. But he said, I think it would be better if you went to university first. Get an experience of life and perhaps even make a more mature decision about the priesthood. Well, I left rather disappointed from seeing him, but I went to university just locally and so continued my involvement in the parish. And so at the end of university, went back to him, and applications were made, and I went to St. Augustine's Seminary in Toronto. Now you have to remember that I was living in Sherbrooke, Quebec. That's even east of Montreal. So my parents drove me up to the seminary. My father tells me that on the way home, my mother cried all the way. Well, she went to get some consolation, I think, from the parish priest. But our parish priest had retired that summer. I went to the seminary, and we had another parish priest, but wasn't quite as sympathetic as Monsignor Moisa was. And so my mother went in bemoaning the fact that she had lost her eldest son. He wasn't terribly sympathetic. He said, well, for heaven's sakes, he hasn't died or anything. But I think it was the association of my parents with the parents of other students who were studying for the priesthood that allowed her to see the great advantage of this and won her over, as it was. Today, we recognize that there's another development. A lot of the younger priests have had careers even before they go into the seminary. And so there's that call of God that's constantly there. And sometimes it takes us longer to answer it, and sometimes it's a rather crooked road that we have to travel. It's not so much what we choose as it is what God wants us to do, because God gives all of us different gifts and different abilities. A lot of people look at the priest and say, oh, poor father, he doesn't get married and he doesn't have children. Sometimes I look at you with your children and I say, thank God I'm not married. Yeah. When I was rector of the seminary, we had a lot of Queen students who were involved in the parish. And there was this one young man who used to come to me and say, Father, I don't know, should I become a priest or should I get married? He said, which is the better life? I said, yes. He looked at me. I said, they're both good lives. Don't tell me that there's no sacrifice involved in getting married and raising children. And don't tell me that there's no sacrifice in being a priest. but it depends on what God is calling you to. You can't choose by which is better, which is easier. It's got to be the call of God, and you have to be sensitive to that call. That's the determining factor that's there. And so recognizing that there's a lot of sacrifice involved in our lives, I think helps us to understand something of how marriage and priesthood are complementary. Why? Because a recent survey in the United States showed that one of the determining factors is the faith lived in families. That's the root, that's the rich soil that can bring forth vocations to priesthood and religious life. And I think as we look around in the world today, we see that that is not happening. That's why I'm very grateful to Archbishop Mulhall, who has asked us in all of our sacramental preparation to involve the families. I know that's a great shock to a lot of people because we've always left things to the school, and parents had to do almost nothing. And that was a mistake, because faith needs to be lived in our families. That's where it has to begin. You know, there's not just a crisis in priesthood. There's a crisis in every vocation. There's a crisis in living the Christian faith. And that's perhaps why a lot of young people are not getting married in the church. And perhaps that's why there's such a high divorce rate. Why? Because we don't have that sense. God is calling people to the priesthood just as much as he's calling people to the married life. And to have that vocation of being the first ones who are able to implant the seeds of faith in our children. And so we all have to work together. And so if we're going to pray for vocations to priesthood and religious life, we also have to pray for the vocation of marriage. That husbands and wives recognize that they too have been called by God, that they too are the seedbed for vocations in the whole church that is there. Now, some young people may say, well, I don't think I have the gifts to be a priest. I didn't think I did. Would you believe I hated speaking in public? I was extremely shy. And I worried about that going into the seminary. And then, what do you say to people? Well, God is the one that supplies all the gifts. God is the one that guides all of us. Because we have a lot of gifts that we're not even aware of. And so it's not a question so much, do you think you got the gifts? The question is God calling you? And that's what we need to recognize. And so let us look at each other. And I'm glad I didn't have the sacrifice of children, and you can be glad that you have the joy of marriage. But let's recognize we all take up the cross. We all follow Jesus.